The final goodbye message that truly breaks the avoidant person is not the emotional outpouring they expect, not the angry accusations they're braced to defend against, not the desperate plea for them to come back that would validate their importance and their defenses, not the detailed explanation of all the ways they hurt you that would give them opportunity to rationalize or minimize or shift blame, but is instead carefully crafted communication that combines specific elements in ways that penetrate every defense they have, that leave them with no psychological escape routes, that force confrontation with the reality of what they've lost and what their patterns have cost them, that communicate your complete clarity and your final decision without giving them ammunition to use against you or material they can twist to protect their self-image. This message exists as a test of fire that determines whether they're capable of genuine self-awareness and genuine remorse, whether they can sit with the truth of their patterns and their impact without immediately retreating into defensive rationalizations, whether they have any capacity for the vulnerability and accountability that change would require. And simultaneously, it serves as your own closure regardless of how they respond. Because the message is a complete expression of your truth that requires nothing from them in return, that frees you from waiting for their understanding or their apology or their acknowledgement, that allows you to close this chapter with dignity and with the satisfaction of having spoken your truth clearly and powerfully. The message that breaks the avoidant works through specific psychological mechanisms. It reflects their own words and patterns back to them with a clarity that makes denial impossible. It expresses your recognition of their good qualities alongside honest acknowledgement of their destructive patterns in ways that prevents them from dismissing you as someone who never understood them or never saw their worth. It communicates your complete acceptance of reality without bitterness or ongoing attachment that would give them hope of future reconciliation or would suggest they still have power over your emotional state. It establishes firm boundaries for the future that make clear you're unavailable for their patterns, while simultaneously releasing them from any obligation to change for you because you're moving forward regardless of what they choose to do with their recognition. The power of this message lies not in what it demands from them, but in what it reveals to them about themselves and about what they've lost. It holds up a mirror that shows them their patterns and their impact with devastating clarity. It proves you see them more deeply than they see themselves. It demonstrates you're choosing yourself and your future over any hope of reconciliation with them. It leaves them with a permanent record of someone seeing them clearly and choosing to leave anyway, because their patterns made staying untenable despite their good qualities and despite the connection that existed. The essential elements that make a goodbye message devastatingly effective. The final goodbye message that breaks through the avoidance defenses contains specific, essential elements that work together to create a psychological impact that other communications cannot create. Understanding these elements reveals what makes the message effective and what distinguishes it from messages that avoidance can easily dismiss or defend against. 1. The message must reflect their specific patterns back to them with clarity and accuracy that makes denial impossible, while avoiding accusations or emotional language they could dismiss. The avoidant's primary defense is denial or minimization of their patterns, claiming they weren't that bad, that you're exaggerating, that you're too sensitive in your perception. The effective goodbye message neutralizes this defense by describing their patterns with such accuracy and specificity that denial becomes psychologically untenable. Not, you were distant and cold, which is vague and subjective, but you withdrew every time I expressed vulnerability. You went silent for days after moments of closeness. You created distance precisely when intimacy was developing. This specificity, this accurate naming of exact patterns, forces recognition because the detail proves you truly saw what was happening rather than misinterpreting their behavior. The key is describing patterns factually without an accusatory tone, not "you're an avoidant," but "these are the specific behaviors I observed and their pattern over time." The factual tone without emotion makes the observations harder to dismiss as angry exaggerations. 2. The message must acknowledge their positive qualities and what you valued about them to prevent dismissal of you as someone who never understood or appreciated them. The avoidant protects themselves by telling themselves that people who leave didn't really know them, didn't see their good qualities, couldn't handle their complexity. The effective message destroys this defense by demonstrating clear recognition of their positive qualities, their intelligence, their depth when they allowed it, their capacity for understanding, specific moments of genuine connection or vulnerability they offered. This acknowledgement proves you did see their good qualities, did appreciate who they were beneath their patterns, did understand their complexity. This makes it impossible for them to dismiss you as someone who just didn't get them or didn't appreciate them. The acknowledgement also makes the leaving more painful because they cannot tell themselves you left out of ignorance. You left despite seeing and valuing their good qualities, which means the patterns were serious enough to override the positives, making the message more devastating. 3. The message must express complete acceptance of reality and complete clarity about your decision without bitterness that would suggest ongoing emotional entanglement. The avoidant can defend against messages filled with bitterness or anger by telling themselves you're just upset now but will come around later, that your emotions are clouding your judgment, that once you calm down, you'll change your mind. The effective message destroys this defense by communicating complete calm acceptance. Not, "I'm so angry at you," but "I accept that this is who you are and that your patterns make a relationship with me impossible." Not, "I hate you for hurting me, but I understand your patterns come from your wounds and I accept I cannot change them." This acceptance without bitterness communicates that your decision is final and is based on clear-eyed understanding rather than on temporary emotion, making it clear you're not going to calm down and change your mind, because you're already calm and your mind is made up based on reality, not emotion. 4. The message must communicate your understanding that their patterns come from wounds while making clear you're unwilling to continue being hurt by those patterns, regardless of their origin. The avoidant often uses their wounds as justification or excuse. "I can't help it. I have trauma. I'm working on it." The effective message addresses this by acknowledging their wounds exist while making clear that understanding the source of harmful behavior doesn't obligate you to continue accepting that behavior. "I understand your patterns come from childhood experiences that taught you closeness is dangerous. I have compassion for the pain that created these patterns, and I am unwilling to continue being hurt by them regardless of where they come from." This communicates both empathy and a firm boundary. You see their wounds and you're still leaving because your well-being matters more than their wound-driven patterns. This destroys their defense of using their trauma as a reason you should stay. 5. The message must establish firm boundaries for future contact that leave no ambiguity about your unavailability while releasing them from obligation to change. The avoidant often maintains hope that the door is still open, that if they eventually do the work, you'll be available, that your leaving is a temporary boundary rather than a permanent ending. The effective message eliminates this ambiguity. "I won't be available for contact going forward. I'm not waiting for you to change. I'm moving forward with my life. You're released from any obligation to work on these patterns for me because I'm building a future that doesn't include you." This clarity serves two purposes. It protects you by making your boundaries crystal clear, and it forces them to recognize the loss is permanent and that their potential future growth won't restore what they've lost with you. The release from obligation to change for you is particularly powerful because it proves you're genuinely done rather than using the message as manipulation to motivate their change. 6. The message must express what you learned from the experience and how it will inform your future without making them responsible for teaching you these lessons. The avoidant can feel some relief from guilt if they believe the relationship, though failed, taught you valuable lessons. The effective message provides this while making clear they're not the heroes of your growth story. This experience taught me to trust my perceptions even when they're being questioned, to enforce boundaries earlier, to recognize patterns quickly. I'm grateful for these lessons, and I wish I'd learned them without the pain, but I have them now, and they'll serve me well. This communicates you're taking something positive forward while making clear the lessons came at a cost you didn't need to pay, and that future partners will benefit from boundaries you'll now enforce more quickly. 7. The message must end with a genuine wish for their well-being that proves your care was real, while making clear that well-being will happen without your involvement. The avoidant sometimes protects themselves by believing you never really cared, that your leaving proves the care was fake. The effective message destroys this by ending with a genuine wish for their well-being. I genuinely hope you find peace with your patterns and eventually develop the capacity for the intimacy you say you want. I hope you get help addressing the wounds driving your behavior. I hope you find happiness. This genuine care communicated in goodbye proves your care was real, making the loss more painful because they cannot dismiss you as someone who didn't really care. Though without your involvement is communicated through context, you're wishing them well in a future you won't be part of, proving the care exists but doesn't create obligation for continued relationship. 8. The message must be complete enough that it requires no response while leaving space for response that you're not depending on. The effective message doesn't ask questions, doesn't request explanations, doesn't demand apologies, doesn't create hooks that require response. It's a complete expression of your truth that stands alone. But it also doesn't explicitly forbid response, allowing them space to respond if they choose, while making clear through tone and content that you're not waiting for response, not depending on their acknowledgement, not requiring their understanding to move forward. This completeness without demands is powerful because it proves you're not using the message to manipulate response, but are genuinely saying goodbye, which makes any response they offer potentially more genuine because it wasn't demanded or manipulated. Why? This message breaks their defenses in ways other communication never could. The final goodbye message, constructed with the essential elements, breaks through the avoidance defensive system in ways that other communications throughout the relationship never could. Understanding why this particular message succeeds where others failed reveals the psychological mechanisms that make it devastating to their defenses. This message breaks their defenses because it comes at a moment when their defensive system is already weakened by your departure, making penetration possible when it wasn't before. Throughout the relationship, the avoidance defenses were fully operational, continuously active to protect against intimacy and vulnerability. Your presence, your care, your attempts to connect all triggered their defenses reflexively. But your departure creates a crack in the defensive system. You're gone. The immediate threat of intimacy is removed. The defensive system isn't as actively engaged. The goodbye message arrives through this crack at a moment when defenses are lowered because you've already left, when they're already experiencing the loss. The message penetrates not because defenses don't exist, but because they're temporarily weakened by the shock of your absence, allowing the message's content to reach them in ways previous communication couldn't when defenses were fully operational. This message breaks their defenses because its accuracy and specificity prove you truly saw them, eliminating their usual defense of believing people don't understand them. The avoidant routinely dismisses relationship feedback by telling themselves the other person didn't understand them, didn't see their real self, couldn't handle their complexity. But the goodbye message's accurate naming of their specific patterns, its demonstration of understanding where those patterns come from, its acknowledgement of their positive qualities alongside the destructive patterns, all of this proves you did see them, did understand them, did appreciate their complexity. This eliminates their primary defensive escape route. They cannot tell themselves you left because you didn't get them. You left despite getting them completely, despite seeing clearly, despite understanding deeply. This forces confrontation with the reality that their patterns are the problem, not others' failure to understand them. This message breaks their defenses because its calm tone and lack of emotional reactivity deny them the ammunition they need to dismiss you as too emotional or unstable. The avoidant defends against relationship feedback by focusing on the emotional delivery rather than the content. You're too emotional. You're overreacting. You're being dramatic. This allows them to dismiss valid observations by attacking the emotional state of the messenger. But the goodbye message's calm, factual tone removes this defense. You're not emotional. You're clear. You're not overreacting. You're stating facts. You're not being dramatic. You're being matter of fact. This forces them to engage with the content of what you're saying rather than dismissing it based on how you're saying it. And the content is devastating because it's true, and they have no emotional tone to hide behind. This message breaks their defenses because its acknowledgement of their good qualities prevents them from dismissing you as someone who only saw the bad. The avoidant protects themselves from criticism by believing critics only saw their flaws, couldn't see their strengths, didn't appreciate their positive qualities. But your message explicitly acknowledges the good, their intelligence, their depth, their capacity, their positive qualities. This proves you saw the whole picture, not just the negative. This eliminates the defense of they just focused on the bad stuff and ignored the good. You're explicitly saying, I saw the good and the connection was real, and I'm still leaving because the patterns made it impossible. This makes the message impossible to dismiss as one-sided or unfair perception. This message breaks their defenses because it releases them from obligation to change while simultaneously proving their patterns have real costs. The avoidant sometimes defends against pressure to change by resisting the pressure. I won't change just because you want me to. But your message removes all pressure by releasing them from obligation to change for you, making clear you're moving on regardless of what they do. This eliminates resistance-based defense while simultaneously forcing confrontation with consequence. Their patterns cost them a relationship with you, and changing or not changing won't restore what's lost. This paradoxically makes them more likely to face their patterns honestly because the pressure to change for you is gone, leaving them alone with the question of whether they want to change for themselves given what their patterns cost them. This message breaks their defenses because it communicates complete finality that eliminates their usual safety net of believing they could return if they wanted. Throughout the relationship and after previous conflicts, the avoidant maintained psychological safety through belief that the door was always somewhat open, that they could return if they chose, that you'd be available if they decided they wanted you. This belief allowed them to maintain their patterns without facing full consequences because the loss wasn't permanent. But the goodbye message eliminates the safety net by communicating absolute finality. You're gone permanently. You're not available for reconciliation. You're building a future without them. The door is closed. This elimination of the return option forces them to experience the full weight of permanent loss rather than the temporary discomfort of distance they could choose to end. This message breaks their defenses because it proves you're choosing yourself and your future over any hope of them changing, demonstrating strength that commands respect even from a defended person. The avoidant sometimes dismisses people who leave by believing they'll be back. They're just upset temporarily. They don't really have the strength to stay gone. But the goodbye message proves your strength and your commitment to yourself. You're not leaving with hope they'll change and come after you. You're leaving to build a life without them. You're choosing yourself definitively. This demonstration of genuine strength and genuine self-prioritization is rare enough that it penetrates defenses. They cannot dismiss you as a weak person who will come crawling back, cannot tell themselves you're just trying to manipulate them into changing, cannot maintain defensive belief that your leaving isn't real. Your strength forces respect and forces recognition that the loss is real and permanent. This message breaks their defenses because it exists as a permanent record they cannot escape, a statement of truth they'll return to mentally, even if they initially dismiss it. Unlike verbal conversations that can be rationalized away or remembered selectively, the written message exists as a permanent record. They can read it again when defenses are lower. They can return to it when they're ready to face truth. They cannot rewrite what you said or misremember it to make it less accurate. This permanence means even if their defenses initially dismiss the message, it exists as a time bomb that will detonate later when they're in a different psychological state, when they have distance, when their defenses aren't as active. The message breaks them not necessarily immediately, but eventually reliably, because it's there to return to whenever they're ready to face its truth. The psychological impact the final goodbye creates and how it changes them. The final goodbye message, when constructed with the essential elements and delivered at the moment of your departure, creates specific psychological impact on the avoidant that changes them in lasting ways. Understanding this impact reveals both what the message does to them and why it matters. The message creates immediate shock that penetrates the numbness or relief they might feel about your departure, forcing emotional engagement they weren't prepared for. When you leave, the avoidant might initially feel relief or numbness. Their defensive system creates deactivation that protects them from immediate pain. But the goodbye message penetrates this protective numbness. The accuracy of your observations, the clarity of your understanding, the finality of your departure communicated so calmly and definitively. These create shock that forces emotional engagement. They cannot maintain numbness in the face of a message that proves you saw them completely and are gone permanently. This shock forces them to feel the loss and to engage with the reality of what's happened rather than retreating into defensive deactivation. The message creates cognitive dissonance between their defensive narratives about the relationship and the reality you've articulated, forcing them to question their own version of events. The avoidant maintains defensive narratives about what happened. The relationship was too difficult. You were too needy. They needed freedom. It wasn't right. But your message presents a different reality with such clarity and accuracy that they cannot fully dismiss it. This creates cognitive dissonance, conflict between their defensive story and the reality you've named. They might try to maintain their narratives, but your message creates persistent doubt, persistent questioning of their own version. This dissonance is uncomfortable, and over time often resolves toward accepting the reality you articulated because that reality has the ring of truth their defensive narratives lack. The message creates a lasting imprint of being truly seen in ways that cannot be forgotten or dismissed, proving someone understood them deeply and still chose to leave. The avoidant will carry your message and what it represents for the rest of their life. They've been seen. Someone understood them deeply, their patterns, their wounds, their defenses, their positive qualities. And that person who saw them so clearly chose to leave because the patterns made staying impossible. This imprint is permanent and powerful. Years later, they'll remember that someone saw them completely. This can be a catalyst for eventual growth if they choose to face it. Or it can be a source of lasting regret if they don't. But it cannot be forgotten or erased because being truly seen is rare enough that when it happens, it creates a permanent mark on the psyche. The message creates a comparison point between their defensive perceptions and your clear perceptions, often leading to recognition over time that your perceptions were more accurate. Initially, the avoidant might defend against your observations, might tell themselves you're wrong or you don't understand. But the message exists as a comparison point between their defensive perceptions and your clear-eyed observations. Over time, as they observe their patterns continuing in other relationships, as they see the same outcomes repeating, they'll return mentally to your message and often recognize your perceptions were accurate when theirs were distorted by defensiveness. This delayed recognition that you saw clearly while they saw through defensive distortion is humbling and is often the beginning of genuine self-awareness if they're ever capable of developing it. The message creates a template for what accountability and mature communication look like, potentially educating them about relational health they haven't experienced. For many avoidants, your goodbye message might be the first time they've received clear, mature, non-accusatory, but honest feedback about their patterns. The message models what healthy communication looks like, specific observations rather than vague criticisms, acknowledgement of positives alongside negatives, clear boundaries without bitterness, genuine care alongside firm decision. This template, even if they resist it initially, exists in their mind as an example of mature relating. They can reference it. Some avoidants eventually try to replicate this maturity in their own communications after experiencing it in your goodbye, learning from the model you provided. The message creates a permanent question they cannot fully answer. What if they were right about me? That undermines their defensive certainty over time. Even if the avoidant initially dismisses your observations, your message plants a question they cannot completely suppress. What if they were right? What if my patterns are the problem? What if I did destroy something good? This question persists beneath their defensive certainties, creating doubt that grows over time, especially as they watch their patterns repeat in subsequent relationships. The question becomes more insistent with each repetition of patterns, each subsequent loss, each moment when they recognize they're doing exactly what you described. This persistent question is often what eventually breaks through defensive certainty and creates an opening for genuine self-examination. The message creates a sense of having lost someone rare who understood them at a depth they're unlikely to find again, intensifying their regret and their recognition of the loss's magnitude. Your message's demonstration of deep understanding, its accurate naming of their patterns, its recognition of their positive qualities, all of this proves you were rare in your capacity to see them and understand them. This recognition intensifies their sense of loss because they understand they didn't lose just anyone. They lost someone who saw them clearly, who understood them deeply, who had the capacity to be with them if their patterns hadn't made it impossible. This understanding that they lost someone rare creates more profound regret than they would feel if they believed you were ordinary or easily replaced. The message ensures they understand the magnitude of what's lost. The message creates motivation for change in some avoidants who recognize they cannot continue destroying relationships with this same pattern, though many will resist change despite the message's impact. The final goodbye message is often the catalyst that motivates avoidants to seek therapy, to address their patterns, to do the difficult work of healing their attachment wounds. Not all avoidants respond this way. Many continue their patterns despite the message, despite the pain it causes. But some recognize they cannot continue repeating this pattern, cannot keep destroying valuable relationships, cannot keep paying the cost their patterns exact. For these avoidants, your message becomes a turning point, the experience that finally created enough pain to motivate the difficult work of genuine change. You might never know if this happens, but for some, your message is the catalyst that changes the trajectory of their life. What sending or not sending this message means for your healing journey. The decision whether to send the final goodbye message has specific implications for your own healing process and your path forward. Understanding what each choice means helps you make a decision that serves your healing rather than a decision based on what might impact the avoidant or what might create a response you're hoping for. Sending the message means you get closure through complete expression of your truth, regardless of whether they respond or acknowledge what you've said. The primary benefit of sending the message is not its impact on them, but its impact on you. You get to say everything you need to say, to express your observations clearly, to articulate your boundaries firmly, to close the chapter completely from your side. This expression provides closure because you're not left with unsaid truths, not wondering if you should have been clearer, not carrying unexpressed observations that might haunt you.